All right. Do we have all the panelists here? You can use my seat. You can use my seat. I'll stay down. Yeah, sure. I'll stay down. We'll begin with Dominica. Okay, so take out Dominica. Okay. All right, okay, we will begin with Grenada, followed by Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, then St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I think we can have Antigua to bring up the rear, okay? Okay, so we will now begin the role of Parliament in the implementation of the 2030 agenda. We will begin with Grenada.
Good afternoon, all. All right, Chrissy Worm-Charles, Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment. Unfortunately, my minister is not able to make it today, the Honorable Delma Thomas. So I'm here in her stead to speak to gender inequality and where Grenada is right now in terms of achieving the SDGs 3 and 5. Gender equality is real. And this is a direct quotation from our head of Gender and Family Affairs, the head of the gender machinery in Grenada. And she quotes, "Gender equality is one of the social determinants of health, and both SDG 3 and 5 show their relationships. It is therefore important for all people, including health policy makers and professionals, to recognize that their policies and work cannot treat gender equality as an aside. Gender mainstreaming is crucial." Gender equality and SDGs. So we're looking at Goal 3 and Goal 5. Gender-based violence and public health. So these are some of the experiences from Grenada. Now, the public health implications for gender-based violence. Physical injuries means healthcare responses, medical costs for treatment of injuries, psychosocial issues, and mental health repercussions. Long-term exposure to stress and trauma correlation on the onset of chronic illnesses. Economic loss as a result of the loss of output due to injuries. Grenada healthcare and gender-based violence. The government of Grenada developed healthcare sector standard operating procedures for gender-based violence through the Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment and the Ministry of Health. The protocol formulation was led by the Division of Gender and Family Affairs and supported by the UN Women through the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women and PAHO. It was approved by Cabinet in 2014 and implementation started. So it's from 2014 to 2024. So that policy, it provides guidance to medical practitioners and professionals on how to provide holistic treatment to victims of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. Details are given for the 5 aspects of care. So there are 5 aspects of care, and the medical practitioners, they were trained in that. So we are on the road to 2030. The first, universal screening identification, assessment and intervention, including examination when disclosure of above occurs or when the abuse is suspected but not disclosed. Documentation and reporting. We'd have had major issues in terms of documentation, but now that is encouraged and reporting to as well. Safety assessment and planning, referral to other support service providers. And I can tell you, it is coming in by the droves. So we are seeing that movement and that transfer of services to the different divisions within the ministry. technology is feeling me a little bit. All right. But nonetheless, we recognize that there are many limitations. I can just speak on top of my head. In terms of the nurses and the doctors, what we recognize in the hospitals, some of the doctors are not allowed, I shouldn't say allowed, but some of the doctors, they don't really go to court, right? Because sometimes when we have protection orders or so forth, it's a little bit challenging for them. So that's a major limitation, because if they leave the medical office and attend court, sometimes court can go on for more than 3 months, or even a year, or sometimes longer than a year. So that would mean that the hospitals on a whole would not have the necessary doctors available. So we see that as a major gap. The nurses, because Grenada is a very small society, the nurses sometimes, or even some of the doctors, they are a bit scared. Because in a lot of instances, we have persons, you know, they know your face, they know where you're from. So in instances where, you know, persons may be high risk, so you would see them not wanting necessarily to respond, or even, you know, bring their attention to the Ministry of Social Development or other key stakeholders. I can also say, too, just the same, that we have seen some major improvements in terms of gender mainstreaming, though it's a major challenge, but we are working on it. We have seen changes in different laws. I can speak to this law where you had persons who are doing domestic work, or even working in the road per se. You had a man's salary and you had a woman's salary. And now, yes, for the same job, but now we have seen major changes in those areas. We have a men's desk within the ministry that looks after men's issues and so forth, because we believe that if you want to change a society in terms of in how persons relate to each other or so on, we have to restructure how persons think. It's not just only, you know, advertising and so forth, but necessarily restructuring how they think, so at least when they respond to their females or respond to their children, it will be different. One of the things, too, that we recognize as social providers to communication and the strategies used, we recognize some serious gaps where that is concerned, because we have a lot of unreachable persons. And it's very difficult in a lot of instances to navigate our way through a lot of our social norms and so forth that perpetuates gender-based violence. So it is a burning issue. It still continues to affect persons within Grenada. Are we there yet? Can we see 2030 as being the year when domestic violence or IPV or gender relations have changed? I'm not too sure. Based on certain things that we would have been doing in the last 2 or 3 years, we recognize that a lot of the values are so inculcated within our basic responses that it's a bit of a challenge. So Grenada has a lot of work to do, but we have made progress. In the health facilities, we do have births that are recorded now. Before, persons used to have babies, and it was a little bit of a challenge to locate them. But now it's automatic. As you make your baby, it's registered. All right, and I think that's a major achievement for Grenada to have that. Also, too, we would have seen the reduction in the amount of persons who are not reporting, right? We recognize, too, that persons feel very comfortable in some ways of discussing their issues and their challenges, because we have worked on our communication strategies throughout Grenada. And we are still working on it. We have developed a lot of slogans and a lot of, sensitization programs sponsored by UN and OECS and a lot of our development partners, trying to reduce, the amount of persons who will come in contact with violent partners and so forth. But I can tell you this: the challenge is really real. Patriarchal is not a myth. It is so very real in our interactions, and the technology continues to fail. So, all right. So, to just wrap up a little bit, we have many gaps in our system in terms of the data. How we gather our data, it's a little bit difficult. It's not really disaggregated. We have issues because persons who are 16 years and under, they're still categorized as the same as persons who are 18 and under who can give consent. I mean, 18 and, yes, who can give consent. So there is no real, whenever you do the tally, it's not a true reflection, really and truly, of the amount of teens who are pregnant. And I had a lot of statistics to share. But nonetheless, we are moving forward. And I welcome the opportunity here to just share some of what we have been doing. So with that, I pass on to the next presenter. Thank you.
Just quickly. Okay, we do not have Antigua and Barbuda, and we do not have the Commonwealth of Dominica. I think we have everybody else. St. Kitts and Nevis will be last. So you will exchange position, I think, with another country. So, with that said, I welcome Miss Messiah is the moderator for this panel.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Thank you very much, Grenada, for your presentation and the information that you would have provided. And so I take this opportunity to welcome my colleague from Montserrat to share with us their experiences. Welcome her, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to speak long, but I still want you all to stand up and stretch so you hear everything I have to say. This is a good ministerial and Ministry of Health, hands up. All right, down, in, out. One more time, up, down, in, out. Great, fantastic. All right, and now I can take my seat. Thank you very much. Let me first say thanks to the Nevis administration and to my colleague, Minister Hazel, and UNFPA and PAL Americas for hosting and having this wonderful and interesting discussion on reproductive health and health SDG goal focus 3 and 5. And I'm really happy to be back in Nevis after spending many summer vacations over here in Bath Village. Not on this side of the island, but in Bath. It's not far away. And I do consider Nevis to be part of the Montserrat landscape in the sense that it just takes a boat across. And those who came across for St. Patrick's will know a lot about that. So I'm happy to be here to return that honor to be here to participate in this very important conference. And as we look at the role of Parliament in the implementation of the 2030 agenda, Montserrat would have had to come align with our other colleagues. Even as a British Overseas Territory, we have the responsibility to ensure that our island moves globally as well. And from a parliamentary point of view, as minister with responsibility for everything SDG in the sense of from life, death, and the spiritual, I have a great task before me in ensuring this alignment. As you know, my portfolio covers ecclesiastical affairs that deals with the religious. It covers social development and elderly. It covers youth, sports, education, and health. And with that, have to be very well aligned with what's happening on the SDG development agenda. In the Montserrat context, we would have looked at things from a strategic point of view in first adopting at the policy level what our policy priorities are. And with health being one of the number one priorities for the government of Montserrat, it was important for us to ensure that the changes and the developments for the country are also aligned regionally and internationally. As part of various meetings across the OECS at the CARICOM level and at the international level, we were able to have some good support in relooking our strategies And from the health, I'm going to take the health umbrella that takes into consideration the areas of social development and gender development as well. We have now redone the whole strategic plan for the ministry, which focuses on strengthening primary health care, which has been a very good cornerstone for the region for over 40 years. There's a tendency as we look outside and, from a regional point of view, model other countries in things that are difficult for us to implement. And so we felt it was important, in order for us to get back on the trajectory, in order to reach most of our people, is to put back primary health care as the focus. And so our strategy seeks to improve primary health care, looks at universal access to take into consideration migrants. But the reality is that we have a lot of nationals from other countries that move between the countries and live and work in our countries, but some of our policies prevent them from getting access to health care. In addition to that, we've also looked at strengthening our vector control, and that is in public health. We know that mosquito-borne diseases are rampant in the region, and with the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the need for us to strengthen strategies of how we reduce the impact of those, coupled with the effect of climate change. And so our health policy takes also into consideration these key areas, but critical to that, health human resources, the development, the recruitment, and the retaining of our human resources in the health sector. This has been a challenge, especially at the international level, where our nurses and even our doctors are pulled away from us, where they are offered higher salaries than we can offer in the region. Part of it, too, because of our failing and weak infrastructure, many of our doctors who have trained in more modern environments are not very pleased with the equipment and stuff that they're working with, and that affects their ability to grow and to remain current in their areas. One of the things coming on board for Montserrat is looking at having built a safe hospital, which also take into consideration the new technology and modalities required for improved health care. And even after going on 24 years of volcanic activity, Montserrat still operates from a school that was renovated as a hospital. But one of the things that I found critical to healthcare, it is not necessarily the buildings and so much the facilities, but the skill sets and how you develop and maintain those skill sets to be able to provide the specialist services and the healthcare services needed to reach those in our community. So we have looked at building individuals from the very lowest level right up, including our doctors, and looking at how we partner with international organizations to help join us in being able to reach those. I must say, though, that our greatest challenge is doctors moving between the countries, because we do compete with one another for doctors. So I lose doctors to Antigua and I lose doctors to other countries in the region, when after coming to Montserrat, recognizing that we may not have the state-of-the-art equipment that they may have, and the fact that in Montserrat you do wear many hats, it is a turn-off for some doctors. However, we have invested significantly in having our own locals being grown, and we have 4 of our locals completing their medical doctors training in Jamaica and 1 in Trinidad, which we're expecting to come back home to help fill some of the gaps that we have in this regard. So in that place, that is a plus for us. One of the other things we are working on in our new strategy is really living the regional connection. So we've already started discussions in Antigua, where we look at, given the size and the population of Montserrat, given what we're able to offer, knowing that our population size has dwindled to 5,000 people, there may not be as many cases as we try to stay as healthy as possible for doctors. One of the things that we look at in partnering with Antigua is the idea that when somebody walks through the doors of the hospital in Montserrat, it's like walking through the doors of Mount St. John. And how can we then look at what is offered in Mount St. John, where that patient is referred, and what is provided in Montserrat, where the care is being taken, where they're being referred in Montserrat in terms of their care and follow-up care. So we're looking at that integration of how we can better utilize our resources between our neighboring countries to improve health care. That also looks at the point of us looking at the national health insurance and health financing. Now, looking at a population of Montserrat of 5,000 persons, 2,000 working people, then 2,000 persons cannot run a national health insurance for a country where you can have issues of cancer to some kind of traumatic injury that requires significant funds to be spent. Because you never know what kind of illness may pop up on you or what kind of incident may pop up on you that requires a significant outlay of funds for financing. And with that, we are also working with the government of Antigua and Barbuda, looking at how we partner with them in looking at one national health insurance that can work both for Antigua and Barbuda and Montserrat. And it's something that I want to encourage the region to look at, sitting with my OECS Minister of Health chair hat on, at how we can better collaborate as a region to help cut the costs of some of these interventions. Because as we do things individually, it costs you more. But when you pull it together, the head count makes a big difference in the cost that you pay per capita. So it's something that we need to look at in terms of how we can improve our health spend and health dollars within the region. Continuing on our portfolio, one of the things that was done for ensuring that we're able to move along the SDG 2030 agenda line was the restructuring of the Social Services Department. The department needed to be modern in the sense of being able to respond to the policy challenges in Montserrat. And with that, we have aligned it with those priority areas such as gender under our adult safeguarding section, but we are now pulling gender out on its own to give it more prominence and more focus as we look at things like the legislation. So currently before Parliament, at committee stage, is our gender violence bill, domestic violence bill. And I say gender because in that bill, you will not see he and she, but you will see the respondent, and you will see that it is very much equal. Because we recognize that even though the statistics speaks to more women and children being the ones affected by gender violence, that men too are also affected. And also that it takes men working in partnership with women to bring that change around. A woman alone cannot do it. And so we have put a lot of focus on getting men to understand their role in the gender agenda. And last year, we have brought and recognized International Men's Day in Montserrat, so they too understand that they have a responsibility for the overall change that we are seeking to achieve in moving towards gender equality. And on that note, we have moved ahead and had a very strong campaign on child safeguarding. And that brought the multi-sectoral team working together, that includes police, the school, the sporting associations, in looking at how we address and deal with children in their environment and in their care. And we have been able to strengthen our legislation. So there's a child care and adoption legislation that was put in place to deal with issues as it relates to children and children care. Critical to achieving Goal 3 and 5 is education. And likewise, at the planning level in the Ministry of Education, we have introduced a planner who focuses on the data. So we have an appreciation of how well our boys and our girls are doing, what subject areas they are being challenged in, and what type of interventions we need to put in place to help them to be as productive as they can be. We've also looked at opportunities in the youth section where persons would have not had the opportunity to complete their secondary education with the requisite qualifications, and we do have late bloomers. Under the Youth and Sports Development Program, youths in our community have the opportunity to choose a pathway in which they would want to take, and we provide them with a stipend as well as the skills and the experience that they will get. We also pay the business persons to hold them, and we started as a pilot first with 18 months, and now we've integrated it into a full-fledged program of the Youth and Sports Department, and also including community development and ecclesiastical affairs, so that it's given greater focus of how the community helps to work with our young people. So this gives us the opportunity to ensure that Goal 3 and Goal 5 and Goal 4 in terms of education, that we're moving along the pathway to achieving the SDG goals. And wrapping that up, we have also put in place an M&E, so under the Monitoring and Evaluation Unit, they monitor and evaluate how we're moving against these targets. So the Statistics Department, as well as the Policy Department, has taken on board our policies. Now, we are in granting aid. 60% of our recurrent budget as a result of the volcano comes from the British government. So it also means that we have to be tracking targets. What we've done is tied our targets in line with those targets to ensure that we are moving along one pathway, at the same time meeting different stakeholders' needs and desires and obligations while we are moving towards achieving the SDG goals. So that has been my presentation in terms of what we're doing in Montserrat. And before I go, there's many more, but just to wrap up, a key note is in relation to sexual health, and the fact that our framework that we have in place have led us to be able to eliminate the transition of syphilis and HIV, mother-to-child transmission of that. We also have a very good immunization program, and I've also introduced the HPV vaccine as well, which is available to teenagers for protection of, we have a lot of these fibroids and other diseases that come along as a result. So on the sexual health element of it, we've also been very open in sexual education. Contrary to what the data says in terms of age 18, we do teach sexual education in our schools, and we do allow children access to be able to have condoms, etc., as part of the campaign that included the prevention and reduction of SDGs as well as HIV in Montserrat. I hope that this finds you. My contribution gives you an enlightening to what's happening in Montserrat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to go right ahead and call my colleague from St. Lucia to make her presentation. Let us welcome her.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. It has been a long day, although lunch was very nice. I will adopt protocol that has already been established and speak mostly on the side of health, because in St. Lucia, my portfolio is health and wellness. It does not include gender relations and so on. On September 25th, 2015, September 25th, 2015 is a landmark date in contemporary human history. The unanimous adoption of the 2030 SDG agenda on that date provided the blueprint which set the stage for an ambitious yet imperative plan of action aimed at generating transformation within and among countries. In comparison to its predecessor, which we heard about this morning, the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs are not confined to our developing nations. The SDG roadmap urges all governments to institute more resilient national development plans, but strategically dismantling structures that sustain conditions which entrench poverty, social inequity, environmental degradation, and ill health. The very process of visioning and actualizing the Sustainable Development Goals speaks to the value of transformational leadership in positively changing the trajectory of development at a national and global level. Critical to the SDGs is the innovation of thought, of alliances, of policies, of action, and most importantly, of leadership. As such, this 2030 agenda necessitates a paradigm shift from our leadership and governance frameworks and a reorienting of the processes through which our national development challenges can be addressed. I am, as a parliamentarian, and by extension all our parliamentarians, should be poised to be the champions of this change by virtue of 1, being the legislators, 2, having oversight for the national policy agenda, and 3, being accountable for the outcomes of national development. I heard this morning about the system. People who blame the system. And I stayed there and I asked myself, who and what is the system? But we will come back to that. Further scrutiny of the 17th SDG goals emerged the principles of partnership, participation, interdependence, and inclusivity. These are the very principles which mirror and underpin democratic governance upon which our nation states are built. As such, moving the SDGs from paper to practice will prove to have the benefit of strengthening the very pillars of our democracy. The question now to be asked is, how are we as leaders, as parliamentarians, breathing life into the SDGs within our various states? It is established that health is a fundamental prerequisite for development, more specifically for sustainable development. A fundamental index of human development is the status of population. My country over the past decades has achieved significant gains within the health sector, which has filtered down to the improved health and well-being of our citizenry. Among these can be highlighted a significant reduction in the infant mortality rates, an improved life expectancy rate, the successful implementation of a comprehensive vaccination program, upgraded treatment modalities, all of which are supported by a highly skilled and competent team of healthcare workers. However, juxtapose this is the 21st century epidemic of non-communicable diseases, which has provided us with many lessons. Prime among these is its associated social gradient of health with the increased risk for an NCD diagnosis and poorer health outcomes by virtue of one's socioeconomic vulnerability. If no other health issue demonstrates the urgency of making advancements with the SDG agenda to erode these inequalities, the NCD epidemic certainly does. This epidemic, like no other, has taught us of the intrinsic link between health and social determinants, poverty, education, social infrastructure, structural inequities, to mention only a few. As our health sector in St. Lucia pursues the right to health of all, there is an ongoing process of health reform. This has resulted in re-engineering our health sector and health service delivery. This is evident in significant investments in building core capacities across the entire continuum of care to improve the healthcare service delivery, bolstering of our national surveillance system for generating high-quality data, and a robust health information system which supports evidence-based decision-making at both the policy and programming level, to identify a few. A cursory look at St. Lucia's more recent pursuits of the SDG agenda reveals steady progress with target 3.3, as we are at the cusp of achieving elimination status for mother-to-child transmission of HIV. The introduction of the hepatitis B birth dose and the introduction of the HPV vaccine in 2019 for both boys and girls within the age range of 10 to 11 years. There has been sustained effort over the past year for the implementation of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, that is Target 3A, with submission of the Smoke-Free Public Spaces Bill to our Attorney General's chambers for review and onward submission to the Parliament for adoption, hopefully to be passed later this year. The government of St. Lucia is steadfast in its drive for making inroads with SDG Target 3.8 as we aggressively pursue universal health coverage for our people. Hence my interest in what obtains in St. Kitts. This is a priority for my administration, and we have set the timeline of 2020 to 2021 for this realization. We recognize universal health coverage shall provide an impetus to our drive to achieve health for all and narrow the gap in health disparities which continue to pose a threat to attaining the highest standard of health for our people. The intrinsic link between health and gender cannot be denied. Like health, gender equality is a fundamental human right and rooted in social justice. Fulfilling the right to health compels the fostering of a health system that is more gender sensitive and gender responsive. Though dated, it is worth noting that a Caribbean Development Bank country gender assessment conducted in 2011 identified major gender imbalances in St. Lucia. For our women, these included concerns with sexual and reproductive health services, with particular concern with teenage pregnancy, matrifocal, single parenting, and gender-based violence. It is also well known that gender roles result in variances in health behavior of our Caribbean males. Within our culture, masculinity and its associated norms of risk-taking support health behaviors which include poor health-seeking behaviors within the primary healthcare system, avoidance of condom use, greater propensity to alcohol, tobacco and illegal drug use, and acts of harm and violence to self and to others. It is with these varying health risks in mind that my government remains focused on health system strengthening, recognizing the imperative for our health system to evolve to the point of being responsive to these entrenched disparities. Though challenging to overcome these behaviors, which are embedded in our social fabric, failure to do so will merely prove to sustain current gender differentials in access to health services and contribute to maintaining current poor health outcomes. So though we are objectively aware of the limitations attendant to the status of being a small island developing state, St. Lucia continues to remain purposeful in its pursuit to utilize the SDG platform as a cornerstone of generating sustainable development. Our government remains steadfast in the pursuit of a collective journey of transformative change that will leave no one behind, in keeping with the well-known SDG 2030 mantra. And since I believe in reincarnation, in my next life, when I return, I want to be a system. Because while the system gets blamed for everything, it takes responsibility for none. Nothing at all. I thank you.
Thank you very much, St. Lucia. Clearly your commitment has been well received, and we know that you're truly committed to the SDGs. So to wrap it up, allow me to call my colleague from St. Kitts and Nevis to make her presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I respectfully abide by the protocols that would have been established well before I got here, because I never made it to Nevis until about 2 o'clock this afternoon. Nevertheless, albeit late, I would like to join the NIA in welcoming those of you who are not Nevisian or Kittitian by birth to St. Kitts and Nevis, If it's your return visit, I say welcome home. For those of you for whom it's the first trip, welcome and do come again. Anyhow, the information I got from Hazel Brandy in a letter dated January 24th was written in a very general fashion that I was supposed to be part of a panel that is supposed to look at the issue of health and gender in St. Kitts and Nevis as a rep for the country. What I did not get, unfortunately, was a subsequent email, unlike my other panelists, stating that we are supposed to be coming armed with the national position. So, as old people say, hopefully I'm fast enough that I could remember certain things and I could represent St. Kitts and Nevis in a half-decent fashion. However, the program in front of you says that the session for the panel was supposed to have dealt with the issue of the role of parliamentarians in the attainment of the SDGs. And for the context that we are in right now, I take it to mean with particular focus on goals 3 and 5. Okay, fine. So I wish to start the brief presentation I have from that premise. One, as my colleague minister from St. Lucia would have indicated, what is the function of a parliament? The function of the parliament is essentially to pass laws, approve contingent regulations, and to ensure that what is done on behalf of the country using the parliament benefits the whole. That's it in a nutshell. By that, you can go on to the second point, which is to state that by passing laws, you also, by extension, are making sure that the various programs and policies broken out by ministerial portfolios will be met by the appropriation bill, better known as your annual budget. In the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, our budget for 2019 was about $770 million. Of that budget, $60.6 million was allocated to the Ministry of Health. And when I say Ministry of Health, I mean Ministry of Health insofar as programming at a federal level is concerned, separate and distinct from the insular budget that the NIA would have for running the health affairs of Nevis. In terms of the Ministry of Social Services, Gender Affairs, and Community Development, that budget is just over 34 million EC dollars. Of that figure, 24 million has been assigned to a new program the government has introduced as of December 2018, which is the Poverty Alleviation Program, which is part and parcel of the wider mandate for the reduction of poverty, even along within the context of the issue of gender equality, because we do realize that there are strong linkages between poverty and gender, mostly females, as it is right now, especially when you put into context that 50% of our national households are headed by single mothers. So that is the scenario against which we are working with here in St. Kitts and Nevis. As I indicated, the budget allocations for the island of Nevis would be separate, and that is something maybe in the discussion phase that our Minister Brandy would be able to speak to a lot better. Now, among the other roles of the Parliament, I would imagine, would be the fact that although you are passing laws and regulations and at the same time passing budgets to ensure that projects and programming is done to meet the objectives for health and gender, would be the oversight that Parliament should be providing. By that I mean, what are we doing with the people's money when we go into Parliament to pass the appropriation bill? Are we achieving what we set out to achieve when we say we've set aside $60.6 million for health and $34 million for social services, of which gender development is a part? So here is where the oversight comes in. And here is where we do have a lot of room as part of the Westminster system of government, where we have not fully utilized the strength and scope of our parliaments in calling the feet of government to account in a better fashion, for want of a better term. Because what should be happening if we, for example, would want to model what we are doing as a national parliament off of, let's say, what happens at Westminster, we would have an opportunity by which we would have a strong opposition, we would have strong parliamentary subcommittees, and at the same time, the regular oversight will be put in place to make sure that what we are doing matches with the national objectives, driven by needs, so that the actual programming money goes to the people who really need the help. Are you following me so far? Okay, thank you. Having said that, what I would say on a last point, before I come on to the specific areas of both ministries, is on the issue of SDG goal number 16. That goal speaks to institutional strengthening, and I would like us to put ourselves in a frame of mind to understand that by extension it should include our parliaments, wouldn't you say, Chairperson Messiah? And as it relates to St. Kitts and Nevis and a number of other OECS member territories, we cannot say that we do have a parliament that is fit for a first world country. The digitization that should take place, the investment in the necessary ICTs that would make participation in parliament easier, even in terms of digitization of Hansard, which is the actual minutes, the shorthand that is taken of all parliamentary sittings. A lot of what we are doing as regional parliaments in the OECS sub-region is still very much manual. So there's a lot of room for that. And once we make the allocation necessary for that digitization, the whole ICT restructuring of our parliaments, and in some cases it might call for the physical infrastructure upgrading, because as it relates, for example, to St. Kitts and Nevis, our federal parliament basically only has a gallery that seats about 70 people. So even when you're swearing a new government, there are a lot of upset people who can't get in the room. So we don't have the luxuries like a parliament in Trinidad or so forth, but it's towards that I think all of us should necessarily be moving so that we encourage more of our public, our Jane Doe, to come in and sit in a parliament and understand how government works, so that they hold us more accountable and they understand what it is that happens from the time you set policy to have a bill being passed that has the necessary consultative process in the middle of it, so that what you result with is a bill that benefits the whole. Having said that, let us move on to health now. As I noted, health has a budget of 60.6 million, driven largely by provisions that we would have for our institution-based healthcare system and our community-based healthcare system. The community-based healthcare infrastructure has 17 health centers. 6 of these health centers are in St. Kitts, 11 are on Nevis. 11 are St. Kitts, the other way around. It's late in the afternoon, my dyslexia is kicking in. So there are 11 health centers in St. Kitts and 6 in Nevis. On the other side of the institutional framework, we have 4 hospitals. We have Alexandra in Nevis and we have 3 in St. Kitts. Jane France General Hospital, which is the main hospital, and we do have 2 cottage-type hospitals, Pogson and Mary Charles. And as by way of mentioning, in the case of Pogson is almost 130 years old. Come this Sunday, they will be 127 years old. So the issue of continuity in terms of infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, is very well grounded in St. Kitts and Nevis. On the issue of the institutional side of it, what we are seeing as a result of the NCD crisis that is confronting us as a region and as a world is that there is an overcrowding in terms of the provisions for the medical ward. That is the type of ward that nurses do not want to be assigned to because it's considered hospital jail. Essentially, that is where you go to cut your teeth to understand what nursing care is all about because of the prevalence of NCDs. As it relates to us and NCDs right now, 83% of our deaths are due to NCDs. Within that issue is the issue of cancer, and that has its own type of epidemiology when it comes to St. Kitts and Nevis, in that in St. Kitts, the leading form of cancer is breast cancer, but strangely enough, in Nevis, the leading cause of cancer is, the leading cancer is prostate cancer. So it's telling you that you have a dichotomy that exists within the bigger crisis of NCDs that we have to channel more funding to cope with these issues. Because when it relates to the NCD issues on breast cancer, it is happening to more of our women in their most productive years. And in the case of men with the presentation of urinary issues as it relates to the prostate cancer, it's also in their most reproductive years as well. So that is something that we have to look at. Within the issue of the institution-based system, we have sought to respond to challenges of NCDs by the introduction of oncology services at the Joseph N. France Hospital, mainly for the chemotherapy side of it. We have not ventured into the investment yet with radiation therapy, but as was noted by Delmaud Ryan when she spoke about partnerships among islands using Antigua and Montserrat, what we have adjusted ourselves to is that for persons who wish to get radiation treatment, there's a special arrangement with the Cancer Center out of Antigua. And of course, that's if you wish to go that route, because there are other facilities in the region, including Jamaica, Trinidad, Puerto Rico, and so, or even North America, if the patient so wishes. With the area of chronic kidney disease, we are part of a project funded by the Taiwanese government that is fairly advanced, but separate and apart from that, government would have heavily invested in that project. When our government would have taken office in 2015, February, we would have had about maybe 2.5 functioning hemodialysis machines. As it is right now, we have about 8 machines, right, Ms. Stapleton? One of which is a mobile unit that we can take on the wards, especially to deal with persons who might be in the ICU. So as it is right now, all of the machines are now owned by the government, which is something we are very thankful for, because hemodialysis cost is not cheap. The average treatment for hemodialysis, which is about maybe 3 treatments a week you can get, you're talking about maybe $800. So if you're going to get 3 times a week times 52 weeks in a year, you're talking nearly 125,000 EC dollars. And as expensive as we think it is, we are told that it's among the cheapest in the OECS. So it is something that we have put a lot of funding into, especially when it comes to the pharmaceuticals that are needed to drive oncology, as well as hemodialysis, because the drugs, the chemicals, the reagents, they're not cheap. They are not cheap. And in terms of the institutional framework that has to be put in place in terms of investment in equipment and technology, that upfront cost is also very burdensome. But it's a decision that I think all of us are going to have to work towards, because at the end of the day, the health of the nation is the wealth of the nation. And essentially, if we are having people cut down at their most productive years, either because of an NCD or maybe burnout from looking after somebody who has an NCD, pretty soon we are going to have a labor force problem in the Caribbean. As it relates to St. Kitts and Nevis, we have a population of about 50,000 persons, of which 28,000 are on the social security system, which means that these are the people who are the active movers and shakers that make the economy function. And if even half of them are not able, suffering from chronic disability and so forth, then what happens? Because all of us are tiny little islands competing for the same tourism dollars, same sun, sea, and sand. Of course, some of us have gone into diversification into areas such as the Citizenship by Investment Program and so forth, but it is people who power industries at the end of the day. And if we have so much homogeneity in the case of what we have to offer in terms of our economies, it tells us that our competitive advantage is in the people of our country. So health and wellness has to be a prime factor. We are fortunate that at the end of 2017, we were able to achieve the elimination of mother-to-child transmission of HIV and congenital syphilis. We are now at the stage where we are up for review, and it is something we are looking at very closely, because I think you just need to have more than 5 cases and you would have lost your certification. So that is something that we're in the middle of right now before we even progress to EMTCT Plus. So that is something that we are grateful for, but it's going to take a lot to keep it where it is. At the same time, while we have achieved successes in terms of our immunization program, and as I said, I'm seeing our retired CCNS Eunice Brown here. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And we are fortunate in St. Kitts and Nevis to have had a 98% coverage for immunization, especially with the outbreak of measles in the U.S. We are very grateful that we are not in the boat that they're in right now. Nevertheless, it creates some problems for us in terms of port health and the movement of persons through our ports, because we are so heavily reliant on tourism. And given our near catastrophe that we had on a plane load of persons out of the UK last year, which we had to contain very quietly because of our fragile tourism industry, we don't want to have a repeat. Okay? We are thankful that none of them stayed in St. Kitts, but regrettably, Delmord, some of them were coming to you in Montserrat. So, yeah, luckily, okay? So, anyhow, so these are some of the realities that we confront in terms of port health, the movement of persons. Issues to do with human resources for health still confront us. We are at a stage right now where we do share part of the crisis impact as it relates to nurses. Our particular area of need would be in the area of specialized nursing care for oncology, hemodialysis, accident and emergency, the ICU, the surgical theater. Unfortunately, our local nurses do not seem to be interested or have not taken up the gauntlet in terms of trying to specialize post-grad. Okay? We do have a lot of them, more than before, who would have graduated with a BSN in nursing, but at the same time, we are not seeing much going on otherwise. And for those who are passing, going to do graduate programs in nursing, it is more general nursing. And what we need more of is the specialized nursing care. So as a result of that, St. Kitts and Nevis has become a net importer of specialized nurses, particularly out of the Philippines. And it pushes up the cost of healthcare because based on the standing orders for the civil service, you're responsible for their airfare, you're responsible for their housing and their security. Okay? But having said that, there are great lessons that we can learn from the Philippines because they're a global model when it comes to customer service. We have patients who go to the hospitals and they have glowing things to say about Filipino nurses. But they have the opposite to say about some of our local nurses. Some of these issues came to the fore at the recently concluded R&B meeting in St. Kitts, which I will not get into at this point. But there are things that we have to work on. There's a difference between service and servitude, but at the end of the day, attitude is everything. So I will not say much more on that. The other issue I would like to raise with us, though, is when it comes to our middle management in healthcare, practically across the entire civil service, because I can't speak for your respective territories, but where we find the gaps are in terms of the civil service is in terms of weaknesses when it comes to succession planning, particularly with middle management. And it is that same middle management that poses the problem for the top management in the healthcare infrastructure. They pose challenges because of an unwillingness to take on responsibility, challenge of the persons in charge, they assume a lot, they blame the ministry for everything, and so forth. But then when the time comes for an opportunity for managerial responsibility, you find that there is a reticence or there is a reluctance in terms of going to that next level. So we need to make sure that we build confidence in that particular sector because our people are no worse than anyone else's people from elsewhere. And we would much rather have the specialized care coming from in St. Kitts and Nevis or from the OECS where we already have that infrastructure for the freedom of movement under the OECS Economic Union Treaty than having to bring people in from third countries. Okay? So that might be part of a discussion coming out of this particular meeting in terms of what can we do as a sub-region to deal with some of the human resource issues, especially the crises that we are facing in the individual OECS member territories. Now, I will just like to mention that, as is the case of several other territories who would have presented this afternoon, we are also guided by a recently finalized strategic plan for health, an 18-point plan. And within that plan, of course, featuring very heavily, as Mary Isaac would have stated, is the issue of primary health care, the issue of succession planning, access to medicines, improvements that we would want to see even in terms of the pool procurement within the OECS, because until recently, oncology drugs weren't even listed there. So we were getting them from further afield because we had to. But if we can buy in the pool procurement and cut down on the unit cost, it does us a lot more good. Case in point, for example, the issue of EPREX that is used for kidney patients, persons who are in a state of flux before you get to the point of needing dialysis. When we work out the cost of EPREX in pre-filled syringes out of the pool procurement, it works out to $6 per syringe. If we run out, or if some member state does not pay its bill to the OECS, let me say that again, in the case where certain member states do not pay their bills to the OECS pool procurement, the rest of us who pay our bills are suffering. So if there are persons in this room who can impress by moral suasion your ministers of health in your respective territories to bring your accounts up to date, Dr. Radix, you're glad for this plug, aren't you? Okay? Please do so, because what it means is that if you don't pay your bill, the individual pharmaceutical manufacturers do not know that St. Kitts paid its bill and Montserrat paid its bill, but Dominica and St. Lucia didn't pay the bill. They just won't send the shipment. And when we have to now get a derogation to go outside of the pool procurement, the cost goes through the roof. For example, we had an issue of a shortage, Nurse Brown, about 2 years ago. with the EPWEX, and when we had to procure the EPWEX otherwise, a single vial of EPWEX was costing $93.50 EC. There's a FARC step from $93.50 EC and $6 for a pre-filled syringe. So you understand the differential that we're talking about here? So I wasn't being facetious when I say our OECS member states need to honor the commitment to the OECS pool procurement. And if there are other drugs, depending on the manifestation of disease burden, etc., in your territory, that you would wish to see in the drug formulary for the OECS, speak up and say so. Because the existing formulary doesn't have everything in it. Because we are a small OECS member territory, and we can't afford everything. For example, in 2016 or 2017, we had 3 suspect cases of Zika in St. Kitts and Nevis. And of course, there was no immunoglobulin locally because it's not the kind of thing you stock because it's not cheap. But thankfully, because we were paying into the PAHO contribution as it relates to the emergency fund for drugs, we were able within 24 hours to procure the immunoglobulin out of Barbados and out of Guyana. If we did not pay that fund to PAHO up front, we would have been in trouble. Because every member state that we tried to ship the young man out to, the first case, refused to take him. Barbados, who claimed they had their hands full, and Puerto Rico said, don't bring him here. So it then means that your ICU department must go overtime to make sure you have access to that drug. Okay, so these are some real issues that I would like to get us to think about because we are small, but there's a lot that can be achieved through partnership. The goal number 17, partnership for the goal, was not put in there just to fill up the space. I think it has a purpose. And that purpose runs in terms of the strategic partnerships that need to exist for sustainable development, in terms of government, the private sector, the NGOs, civil society organizations, because nobody can do it on their own. It must take partnership because we are that small. And even as members of a subgroup that is part of the wider 193 UN member territories, even at that level, you still don't have all the resources, especially when you have big boys like the US telling you they're not paying a cent again into the UN. The shortfall is always felt someplace else. And the small island states, especially the independent ones, are who feel it the most. Climate change and health, these are issues we are still working towards. We are very fortunate that the CARICOM lead head for health, is the Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Timothy Harris, who has really taken on this matter very seriously. He has actually co-authored 1 or 2 pieces with Dr. Hospitalis, the outgoing executive director of CARFA, as it relates to NCDs and climate change being 2 sides of the same coin. And it is worth reading. It is something that we need to further discussion on because there are 2 catastrophes, given the fact that one is climate-related as it relates to our susceptibility to severe storms and hurricanes, which we have no control over, but also from the standpoint of the invasive and pervasive nature and debilitating nature of NCDs, which have already transcended health and have now become a socio-economic problem, because that is where it is right now. Under gender, if I could go quickly before I take up too much more time, our Gender Affairs Department in St. Kitts is powered by about 5 staff members. We have done quite a bit of work in terms of responding to issues of sexual violence, domestic violence, assaults on minors and the elderly, 2 of our most vulnerable groups. I am happy to report that the number of cases of domestic violence have reduced dramatically from about 2016 right up to 2018. What we are noticing, however, is that there seems to be a disconnect between the police, the Ministry of National Security's data, and that which is housed by the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Gender Affairs. For example, when I prepared for our 2019 budget, which was presented in December, I discovered that the police data from the Special Victims Unit states that there was 1 case of rape for the entire 2018 up until the end of November. Our data from Jane France Hospital said, no way, there were 12 cases. That is a big problem. What this is telling me is that you might have people presenting to JNF for post-rape care, but maybe are too afraid to come forward and press a charge. And that is a problem. And a lot of it comes from the stigma that might be associated with the rape. It could also be the other circumstances surrounding the rape, mother's boyfriend, be it basically starting to move in on the children now, or it could also be a case where it is an issue of incest and other possible reasons that might make people not want to come forward. Some of the issues, I think, related to what victims go through in terms of providing evidence. For example, in the middle of last year, I had cause to meet with the senior magistrate as well as the Solicitor General and our Director of Gender Affairs to ask for certain changes to be made in the court itself in terms of how you have the spatial layout of the court so that you don't put the victim to rehash the same thing over and over and over again. You give your statement once. If you have to be there in camera, fine, but not this rehashing over and over again. And so we have tried to work on that. There was a Domestic Violence Act that had all 3 readings in 2014. Regrettably, it was never gazetted. Don't ask me how that happened. Our government took office in February of 2015, so this was before our time. Needless to say, it's an opportunity for us to review the bill, bring it up to date even further. We are now being told that the bill has a lacuna in it, in that if a domestic incident starts at home, but then the fight goes on outside on the beach, it is no longer domestic violence. Ms. Masai, I don't agree with that, neither do you, right? So that is, I don't know how that happened, and that is something that we need to fix because it can't stand, okay? But according to the senior magistrate, that is her interpretation of a lacuna that is in that particular bill. So maybe it's a good thing it wasn't gazetted, because then it would have created a loophole for some persons who would have gotten away with things that they should be penalized for. However, having said that, even though it's not gazetted, what it gives you is the opportunity to file an assault charge, because in some instances, the penalties for assault might go beyond the domestic violence with the battery charges. So that is still something that we have to look at. The Domestic Violence Complaints and Reporting Protocol, that has been around for ages. And it was in November of last year that we did finally launch the protocol after the present government would have approved it. We would have approved it since 2016. There were 2 or 3 other rounds of consultation that took place, and we are now ready to get it approved. But because it is built on the legislative framework of the 2014 bill for domestic violence that was not passed, we cannot, because of that technicality, formally launch it, even though most of the provisions in it are already operational. Because the partnership that should exist between the Special Victims Unit, the hospitals where you go for emergency care after the assault, as well as the Gender Affairs Department, those 3 agencies work together. And I guess it helps having one minister in between, because in many of the cases when the rapes occur, since I can't turn off my phone, it could be 2 or 3 in the morning, and I'm getting the phone call from Ms. Christopher, our Director of Gender Affairs, that a rape has just happened, how horrific it is. And she is the one who is then calling SVU, because the information has not gotten to where it needs to get to within the police force, even though 911 has been notified. So there are still some glitches in the system that we need to work on. The issue of gender mainstreaming as it relates to our young boys, that is a major issue for us as it relates to gang violence and the absentee fathers situation that we continue to suffer from. We would have launched a boys mentorship program in St. Kitts in 2016, funded by companies including Rams and National Bank. Those are 2 of our biggest sponsors. We started with 1 pilot at the Sandy Point High School. That has now expanded to the Bastia High School, and I think Washington Archibald High School will be next. Tied into that is the assignment of mentors to these young fellas, because most of the time the father's not there, the mother is on boyfriend number, whatever it might be. All of the children in the house have different fathers, and it's a repetitive cycle of making sure you have a child for this man so that you could get the child support for the rest of the other men who already stopped paying child support because nookie that he was getting before, he no longer getting. That is essentially what is happening. So you have that situation developing. Some people are slow to hear that part, but anyhow. Yes, so anyway, that is essentially what has happened. So you have school teachers, you have pastors, people who are permanent secretaries, middle managers in the private sector and so forth have stepped forward to provide mentorship to these young people. And some of them you really have to keep your eye on, because as early as 13, some of them are already having gun charges. We do have the New Horizon Rehabilitation Center, which is part and parcel of that rehabilitative response, which is part of the bigger OECS Juvenile Justice Reform Program. It is a pilot that should be replicated in the other OECS member territories, partly funded by USAID. There are still some kinks that would need to be sorted out with that because of the US interpretation of what a center like that should have, with the reality of the challenges here on the ground. The center services two types of clients: children who are in there for care and protection, and it's a co-ed facility, and then those who are in what is considered the remand center. For example, as of last week, I had 3 young men in the remand center who are in there because of gun charges or attempted murder, and in the case of one, for murder itself. But they're 18, 16, and 17. And even though the 18-year-old would have gotten to the age where he should be in the big jail awaiting trial because that's a no-bail type of arrangement, the DPP has made a special request to keep him there because they do not want him mixing with the hardened criminals in the jail so that he doesn't have a worse outcome. So essentially, these are some of the things that we grapple with. It is not a perfect situation, but I think in everything that we do, when we speak about the SDGs, we have to make sure that it benefits the whole. The same way I started out is the same way I want to end. And that is making sure that you get people responsible for programming in terms of government, and you get parents responsible for their children at the same time. Because there's too much of an abdication going on where you're asking, what the NIA doing about them young people? What Timothy Harris doing about these young people? But they're your children. They are your children first and foremost. And you ask, what the church doing? Last time I checked, the church is all of us who go and warm a seat on a Sunday and maybe the midweek service, not the people who form the clergy. So then what are we doing then? Comes back to the argument that Mary Isaac had about being part of the system. Okay? I wasn't here for that anecdotal proof, but I understand where you're coming from with that. But that is an issue, and it is for that reason why we have decided between health as well as gender to make sure that the family is central to everything that we do. Pope John Paul many years ago said that the family is what he regards as the domestic church. So if you don't get that part right, don't expect to get outside the door right either. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Phipps. Let me just exercise a little moderator prerogative here to say that we've had a lot of information, and in my experience, I know there may be questions. However, while these women have done a phenomenal job, we have to find a way to get these questions to the CARICOM heads. That is where the decisions really will be made, right? But just to exercise a little further moderator prerogative, I would just wish to say, having heard what these 4 ministers would have shared with us, it seems to me that there are common challenges. There have been some overlap in terms of achievements. But what it brought out for me is the need in particular areas to have what is known as omnibus legislation, where what obtains in Montserrat and St. Kitts can be replicated right across the OECS in particular. And I say that because we are moving towards a more perfect union, if you will, in terms of our immigration across the OECS and across CARICOM territories. And I just like how in certain business areas where you have in the CARICOM arrangement the right of establishment, where you cannot have less or more favorable treatment in one or 2 or other Caribbean territories. I believe that certainly in areas of gender and other social services and so on, what obtains in Antigua and Barbuda, when you open the law books in St. Kitts and Nevis and in Dominica and so on, you must see the same thing, right? So persons who may forum shop, if you will, if you have a person who would have done a particular heinous crime here, would have served time, you mustn't come to Antigua and Barbuda, never having been perhaps rehabilitated fully, and commit the same act because you say, well, if I do it here, the sentence is less or what have you, right? We have to come together and approach these things in a more holistic way if we are to achieve these sustainable development goals. Just one last point, and I wanted to say it earlier, but since it was brought up here, I have been on a soapbox for a while to say that Minister just spoke about the possible injuries to our tourism product, that we're all in it. And I believe when the presentation was made earlier, the point came out that why is it that there's less of a focus in terms of certain subject areas and the like? And I believe that what we are missing, and we've been missing for too many years, is the need. We know what we have, what our niche products are, the need to diversify our economy, and particularly the lead sector in our economy. Yes, we have sun, sand, and sea, but out of that we can have so many other things. Tourists are looking, and locals are looking for different kinds of experiences as well. And so I've always posited, why don't we focus more on medical tourism, sports tourism, ecotourism, agro-tourism, cultural tourism, culinary tourism, education tourism, research and development tourism, heritage tourism, just to name a few. Because when you have that kind of focus, what it affords is more career options for our young people. And this is where the technical and vocational may play right in, because out of all these different disciplines, what you will see is students perhaps who have a keen interest in food and nutrition going off to tertiary education to study food science, food technology, that can augment the very culinary tourism that we will put on offer, so that when you pick up some jam and jellies in some of our hotels, you're not seeing, is Welsh they call it, but you're seeing anti-mamies, and you see these things, and you know that the young people or the people who would have studied it from the region are well educated, well trained in this area. We will open opportunities for persons to focus more on sociology to support that aspect of the tourism. We'll have botanists, we'll have historians, agronomists, radiologists to support the medical tourism aspect of things. Medical technical specialists, these sorts of things. Anthropologists, grounds persons. I went to a university many years ago, I think it was North Carolina, where in their university program, they had a whole department that was focusing on lawn care, because golf was major in that particular state, much less here in the region where people come for different types of experiences. We have opportunity to train coaches and trainers, cookbook authors, and bed and breakfast entrepreneurs, as well as graphic artists, to support all these things that we're doing. And I just believe, this is just my pitch here, that when more women ascend to the office of Prime Minister, these will become a reality. Thank you for your attention, and we will move to the next session. Yes. So we're going to hold on the questions because we're about 40 minutes behind schedule. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, panelists. You did a wonderful job. And thank you, everyone.
All right, time is going. So in the interest of time, I think we need to move swiftly to two other short presentations. And remember, as I would have indicated, we do have a welcome cocktail reception that begins at 7. Okay, so at this point, we want to invite the person for the next presentation, and that is emboldening the Caribbean's presence and partnership with the International Association for Promoting Geoethics, IAPG, a new era of policy and legislative activism. And that person, please welcome her, Miss Carla Rivera, the Executive Director of IAPC. Please welcome Ms. Rivera.
Hello, good afternoon. Please allow me to adopt the protocol already established. Dear ministers, members of parliament, delegate representatives of the various agencies, and ladies and gentlemen, I must add that there was the most interesting acronym for the organization. But I would first like to thank the organizers and sponsors of this important forum for giving me the opportunity to be here today. I'm here as the Executive Director of the Inter-American Parliamentary Group on Population and Development, formerly known as IAPG and currently known as GPI for our Spanish acronym. And I will also speak on behalf of Honorable Moses Jean-Baptiste from St. Lucia, who was elected as our chair for the Caribbean Parliamentary Forum, which is the Caribbean arm of our network, and who was not able to come due to unforeseen circumstances. It is an honor for me to be here today, speaking on the role of parliaments in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. As the speakers before me had rightly indicated, it's a complex issue. And I'm very pleased to see so many distinguished parliamentarians who have been able to make space in their busy agendas. As we gather in this beautiful island, you are considering important issues about health, sexual and reproductive health and rights, violence against women, education, gender equality, under the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for sure, and that need our urgent attention. Your attention, our urgent attention. We just finished the CSW recently in New York last week, and as we prepare for the upcoming ICBD, which is the Commission on Population and Development in April, and we start celebrating the 25th anniversary of the ICBD, we welcome this opportunity for an open dialogue so that these issues are placed on top of the parliamentary agenda. My organization, the Inter-American Parliamentary Group, is an alliance of committed parliamentarians from all political spectrums who are working together to promote reproductive health and rights within the framework of the international human rights mechanisms adopted by the governments. GPI was established with the firm belief that by enacting and improving the relevant laws and policies, parliamentarians continue to contribute to creating an enabling environment for exercising reproductive health and rights, achieving the goals of the ICPD, which is the International Conference on Population and Development, the Beijing Platform for Action, and the Sustainable Development Goals. At a more regional level, our work also follows the adoption of the Montevideo Consensus, adopted in 2013, and its operational guide, which has marked a milestone for the advancement of human rights in the Latin America and Caribbean region. Parliamentarians are the link between society and government, and therefore they are important actors in the promotion of sexual and reproductive health and rights. In addition to the role as lawmakers, as elected representatives, they can watch over the interests of their constituents, they follow up on the implementation of policies and approve national budgets, and as policymakers, parliamentarians also have the important role of moving forward a social justice agenda that can have a tremendous impact on the lives of women and girls around the world. Therefore, the role of parliaments regarding gender equality is a critical one. As spokespersons for their constituency, parliamentarians represent a potent expression of public will. As lawmakers, they can translate that public will into concrete policy actions. Parliamentarian can serve as a beacon of hope, mobilizing support and commitment to improve women's lives and turning it into political force for change. Moreover, their sheer influence gives parliamentarians a responsibility to act. Sexual and reproductive health issues are often controversial and perhaps are not seen as having enough political payoff. But like other policies, these are the product of important political processes that directly affect the lives of millions of women and girls. Take the case of Lucia, for example. In Argentina, earlier this year, Lucia, an 11-year-old girl, became pregnant after being raped by her grandmother's partner and was forced to give birth. The Argentine authorities refused her plea to terminate her pregnancy, an abortion she desperately needed and to which she was entitled according to the law. You see, in Argentina, the legislation allows for abortion to be performed in cases of rape and when the life of women is in danger. In this case, the law was on her side. Lucia faced a high obstetric risk. Remember, she was 11-year-old. However, the authorities in her province stalled for weeks, forcing the girl to have a C-section and delivering a baby that died shortly after and placing her life at high risk. According to the UNFPA, the LAC region has the second highest rate of teenage pregnancies in the world, and it is estimated that almost 18% of all births correspond to women under 20 years of age. We went into this in detail in the early presentations this morning, so I won't go into detail about that. But while a number of programs are now in place to address adolescent pregnancy at present in the majority of Caribbean states, retain restrictive legislation and practices regarding adolescent access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including family planning, due to the requirement for parental consent and socio-cultural barriers. The first 5-year review of the Montevideo Consensus, which took place in Peru in 2018, states that poverty and inequality remain pressing issues in the Caribbean region. Lawmakers have been fighting for decades to end the cycle of poverty and to achieve social justice for all. Turning high-level development plans into laws, regulations, and programs, and then implementing, administer, and monitor them, as has been said by our previous speakers, is not an easy task. It requires the capacity within the government for evidence-based policymaking, data, and public administration, for which many small governments it can be difficult to maintain. In order to address this and other present issues, the Inter-American Parliamentary Group, along with other regional networks around the world, have been very active since way before the ICPD. Our overarching goal has been to move population and reproductive health issues from a marginal status to the center of a political and social debate, with the prospects of increased regional cooperation. Although there is considerable body of literature on population policy, sharing of experiences is still inadequate. Perhaps this is because political conditions are so varied across countries that experience in one country will not necessarily apply to others. Nevertheless, in the process of policy formulation, as with the content of population policies, there are lessons to be learned from each other. In the Caribbean, the vision of a region-wide movement started in Barbados in 1985 with the Conference of the Caribbean Parliamentarians on Population and Development. This conference called upon legislators across the region to establish national and regional committees to address population and development issues. Later on in September of 2000, the Caribbean Movement of Parliamentarians was launched under the UNFPA umbrella to promote gender involvement in parliamentarians on population and development, including reproductive health and rights. This pilot initiative was the first step in a concerted effort by different actors to bring together parliamentarians from this subregion, given the needs of this particular subregion. In 2008, the Caribbean Network of Parliamentarians on Population and Development was established, considering the lessons learned from previous experiences. More recently, we partnered with the UNFPA Subregional Office of the Caribbean to organize the meeting in June 1st and 2nd of 2018, when the Caribbean Parliamentary Forum was launched, with the main goal of revitalizing and identifying new members who can be champions for the ICPD and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Some of the parliamentarians that are in this room participated in that event, and Honorable Hazel Brandon Williams is one of the coordinators of that network. Through the Caribbean Parliamentary Forum, with a new elected governance structure, new member parliamentarians will be energized and be able to work across party lines as strong advocates for sexual and reproductive health and rights under the SDG framework. Active CPF members will be key to gather support and to mobilize the already existing formal structure to work together to advance the SDGs and the ICPD goals, looking forward to in its 25th anniversary this year. I'm confident that today's meeting will assist you in your deliberations, strengthen your commitment to action, and your understanding of the important roles that parliamentarians can play on issues related to the SDGs. I also wanted to give you a better idea of what it means to work together as a parliamentarian as part of a network. I have a video presentation that I would like to share with you, which was produced back in 2009 within the frame of one of the international parliamentary conferences that we organize around the world. You will see in the video that many of the MPs are no longer in office, but the issues remain valid today. So I leave you with that, and I hope that will also wake you up and help you understand a bit of our work. Thank you very much for your attention. You can put the video. Wait, we'll have a video. Yes. Thank you.
Para cambiar la vida de nuestras mujeres, para cambiar la vida de nuestros niños, de los envejecientes, para cambiar la vida de la pobreza de los países nuestros, necesitamos que los gobiernos y los parlamentos trabajen conjuntamente.
You know, people think that parliamentarians just sit in the capital city, which in my case is Ottawa in Canada. They just sit there and they write laws or they amend laws. Of course, that's what we do. But we do a lot more than that.
Parliamentarians are tasked with being the bridge, being the link between the community, the people, and what actually takes the shape of government's policy.
We have to go out in the field and talk to people, and not so much talk to people, but listen to people.
Para justamente transformar sus demandas, sus angustias en procesos legislativos, instrumentos legislativos, porque las leyes son para proporcionarle calidad de vida a nuestro pueblo. Es muy difícil que haya un parlamento en el mundo que no tenga una comisión que tenga que ver con derechos de las mujeres, derechos de la familia, derechos de la niñez, de la juventud.
También somos los legisladores los que controlamos al Poder Ejecutivo, en cierto sentido los que podemos ir generando los debates, las discusiones para que la ciudadanía apoye esas medidas del Poder Ejecutivo que tienden a cumplir justamente con los objetivos del milenio y los objetivos del Cairo.
And now we are here in this great city, at the beginning of what will be a landmark event for all those involved in population and development, and for the billions of people who count on us to help them realize their hopes for the future.
El gran vuelco del Cairo fue el concepto de derechos reproductivos y sexuales, o sea, el respeto a los ciudadanos, a la ciudadanía. Los objetivos del milenio es un paso más adelante. Son muy concretos, van en una línea muy determinada y se ponen metas, por ejemplo.
La reducción de la mortalidad materna, la mortalidad infantil, el tema migratorio, el tema juventud.
Empoderamiento de las mujeres, de derechos, de avanzar.
Mejorar los niveles educativos, mejorar los niveles de salud.
Tener el derecho a decidir cuántos hijos tener, con quién tenerlos, cuándo tenerlos.
El problema del embarazo adolescente.
Tiene que ver con temas importantes como los del medio ambiente. Tiene que ver con la reducción de la pobreza.
Los problemas relacionados al VIH, SIDA.
Toda esa línea de trabajo aprobada en el Cairo es una de las líneas fundamentales del Grupo Parlamentario Interamericano.
Today marks the dawn of a new promise for the Caribbean region and its diaspora. For the first time, there is representation from a properly formalized Caribbean network of parliamentarians on population and development under the IAPG.
IAPG is the Inter-American Parliamentary Group, which speaks to the Parliament of Latin America and the Americas, really, so it's Central, South, and North America, as well as the Caribbean region.
Aprobó también el legislativo el derecho de las mujeres a una vida libre de violencias.
Luchamos por la justicia del reconocimiento, que significa darle a la mujer el estatus que merece dentro de la sociedad.
Creo que asumimos una responsabilidad de conducir y de guiar esas políticas que vayan buscando los objetivos de los convenios internacionales, pero también de las necesidades particulares de nuestro país.
And we then put pressure on our government to move along faster with larger amounts of money, hopefully, and a better concentration on certain types of programs.
We have got 3 project areas: prevention, care and support, and capacity building.
No se puede desconocer que para todos estos temas el principal responsable es el Estado. Pero nosotros estamos seguros que la posibilidad de que el Estado en América Latina tenga un rol activo depende de los movimientos sociales, de los movimientos populares.
Que el pueblo se haga copartícipe junto con el legislador de los problemas que están en debate de la Asamblea Nacional, que son debates nacionales y que lo van a afectar a él en su calidad de vida, en sus condiciones de vida.
So it has to really be a dynamic partnership between constituents and parliamentarians.
Para que el parlamentario de América Latina, de mi país, pues entienda que tiene un compromiso con su comunidad.
Con la finalidad de ser parte de este proceso de cambio, en febrero del 2009 se formó el Grupo Parlamentario de la República Dominicana, integrado por parlamentarios de todos los partidos presentes en la República.
La red parlamentaria que nosotros dirigimos en mi país está compuesta por los 3 partidos, que esto es muy importante.
O sea, aquí no hay una división derecha-izquierda, sino que vienen de oposición y de gobierno.
Que nos convoque a todos los nicaragüenses por encima de las diferencias partidarias para que nos concentremos en el desarrollo de toda Nicaragua. Muchas gracias, presidente.
Cualquier iniciativa de ley que tenga que ver con estos temas que estamos trabajando acá tiene que tener el consenso de las demás fuerzas partidarias para que pueda ser presentada en el Pleno de la Asamblea Legislativa y obtener el número de votos suficientes para que tenga la fuerza de ley.
Nuestras prioridades estratégicas son la universalidad del acceso a los servicios de salud, incluida la salud sexual y reproductiva.
Con referencia a la mortalidad infantil, consideramos un poquito difícil alcanzar la meta que es 8.2.
Es que los problemas que persigue el GPI y el Fondo de Población son problemas de todo el mundo, ¿no? Indistintamente de la raza, de la cultura, de la opción política.
Pues sumamente congratulados con la presencia de todos ustedes.
Cuando hacemos las reuniones del grupo parlamentario, conversamos mucho sobre cómo han sido la evolución de proyectos que nos interesan. Because people come and they report on what has been going on in their countries, good things that have happened, and things that they really need to work on. And we can take that and learn from that.
Soy el doctor George Norton, un miembro del Parlamento de Guyana.
No es extraño que un parlamentario que asiste a una reunión del GPI o algún foro, ya sea regional o mundial, llega a su país con una claridad en términos de qué hacer, de cómo avanzar, y tiene la experiencia de sus colegas de otros países.
If we see a neighboring country is developing well because they have good systems in place, then we will piggyback on their systems that they've put into place. And this is the good thing about the IAPG, because we can communicate and we can make comparisons with each other.
Un avance muy importante que es que en toda la educación, desde la primaria hasta la universidad, hay educación sexual obligatoria.
Muchas veces los avances en la legislación no tienen relación con los avances en la realidad. La legislación va más adelante que la realidad, pero estamos seguros que si no hay legislación, no hay pasos adelante necesarios para poder resolver los principales problemas de las muertes en la maternidad y todos los derechos sexuales y reproductivos que tiene la mujer.
It really is about making this world a better place for our children, for our women in particular, and for the human population.
My membership in IAPG, I think, is part of all this part of a dialogue that we can have throughout the Americas, North, Central, and South, on this question of population and development.
GPI ayuda a actuar, ayuda a encontrarse, ayuda a la legislación, a intercambios de experiencias legislativas, de estrategias legislativas, de cómo plantear los temas. Es un punto muy importante para nosotros los parlamentarios.
Ensuring reproductive health and rights for all in OECS. Please, we will have Ms. Veronica Sinak, attorney at law and consultant for the UNFPE. Final presentation, and as you realize, most people would have left.
only up to maybe 2016 in some cases. I think that's the latest that we have. But then we went through the task of ensuring that we got direct government sources and got the amendments to the legislation. But there might still be errors. Next slide. So I am giving an overview of what is the status of the legislation so far. Next one. And we'll skip those slides, and that information can be provided to you. We've done an analysis of all of the international conventions that the countries in the OECS have signed on to, including each of the optional protocols under these conventions. I did not see any reservations for any of the OECS territories in terms of the international instruments. The other countries in the region have filed a few reservations, so that would be in the main report. So just in terms of the process, we are at a stage where we have done the legal mapping of all of the laws, and we have written individual country reports. I will disagree a little bit with my minister and colleague attorney in terms of the ensuring that all of the countries are similar in terms of the laws. We're starting from different positions. St. Lucia, for example, is both a civil and common law jurisdiction. So there are some slight differences. We have a codal system in terms of some of our laws, like the criminal codes, etc. We will not necessarily get to a point where we are all similar, but we have to get to a point where we are not at cross purposes. I agree with you on that point. And so looking at the laws is important to ensure that at the end of the day, we are all moving forward. So some of us have gone forward and have gender-neutral domestic violence laws. Some of us are still in the dark ages, you know, only recognizing issues around women. The countries like the BVI and Montserrat have excellent sexual offenses laws that include both male and female. You know, marital rape laws that include, you know, a wife being capable of raping. Oh, thank you. A wife being capable of raping a husband, in a sense. But so that is something that we need to go through. So I'll just go through this. These will be available to you. Where do I point it to? Over here? Yeah. So minimum age of consent for sexual activity. And when Alison did the presentation, you went through that, so I'm going to skip it a bit. The only interesting thing is that most countries have either 16 across the board. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it is 15, which is slightly different. And in some cases, we have the close-in-age defense, so that if the two parties are too close, then none of them will be charged for the offense. The interesting thing is that the age of sexual consent is actually a legal misnomer because it is a defense to a charge of sexual assault. It operates in limited circumstances. So it is not anybody who can get away with it. In all of the territories, there are restrictions in terms of the age of the accused. In some cases, it's 24. In other cases, 21. So they must be under that age, and it must be their first offense. So you can rely on the defense once in most cases. So it is really something that we have to look at in terms of settling the law on the age of sexual consent, and not just it operating in a sort of by implication manner as a defense to a sexual assault. Minimum age to access sexual and reproductive health services, including HIV. It stems from the notion that as a minor, parents have parental authority for minors. A minor is not capable of law of exercising any autonomy. You cannot sign a contract. You cannot make any of those types of decisions for yourself. And that is why, although it doesn't state it, unless the law clearly states that a person of X age can access health services, health being a key concept that is encapsulated in the notion of parental authority, the assumption in law is that you do not have the authority. So the law has to specifically state it. It has been done, and that's just some of the international law authorizing it. It has been done in some countries under the status of children legislation. So, am I correct? St. Kitts? St. Kitts has the legislation that allows children, a person under 16 and over to access a blood test to prove paternity. In Jamaica, the age of to access medical services is 16. In St. Vincent, at 15 years old, you can access medical services on your own. So, I mean, we have examples of countries that have done it. The whole world hasn't, been destroyed because they have those provisions. So it's something that we need to look at. In that case, yeah, we need to be consistent. And it's also, I mean, this is an area that you all deal with. The dissonance between age of consent and the age to access medical services is really very disturbing, because the law is allowing somebody, even if to say that you can consent to an act and then not allow you to consent to all of the consequences that arise from that act. And that is where we talk about as lawyers, the law is an ass. That is one of these issues. And I don't know what is the complication in doing it. We have other examples within the region where children over 16 and over can access medical services. Then we also have common law principles. The Gaelic competence test, which starts at 15, which says that it is a case in the UK that basically sets out a list of questions, a set of rules that a medical professional can ask to a child who they believe is capable of understanding the nature of the services that they're being offered, right? That test is something that is already existing in some policy documents, like the STI guidelines in St. Lucia, for example, has it. And it's something that can also be legislated, because it doesn't apply across the board. It doesn't apply to every 16-year-old or 15-year-old. It will apply in the circumstances where, having gone through the steps that the law allows, the medical profession will make that decision. I need to move a little faster. So minimum age to access sexual reproductive health services, and these are the answers for the countries. As I said, if you see anything that is incorrect, please point it out to me. And if you have any questions, interrupt me as I'm speaking, please, because I think we'll move faster that way. Contraception. Question, does the law allow minors access to contraceptives without parental consent? Because it doesn't specifically say that, and contraception is a medical service, then the assumption is no. The next issue is, the law require married women to gain consent of a husband to undergo tubal ligation and vice versa. Well, vice versa doesn't work, but the law does not have anything. There is nothing in the law that says your husband must consent. Actually, in Antigua, that has changed. Last year, I personally witnessed the Ministry of Health destroying all of the consent forms that they had in the lab and at the hospital, that husbands had to sign. So there was nothing, absolutely nothing in law regulating that. It was a practice that, doctors being males at a certain time, have to get your husband's consent. It's ridiculous. However, in the reverse, a man who requested a vasectomy, or will request a vasectomy from his doctor, would not have to get a woman's consent. The funniest thing is when I saw the forms, it only has space for a husband's consent. There was nothing for the wife's consent. Yes. Oh, I was trying to see you. Here. Oh,
thank you. I'm kind of confused with this second one that you have in terms of requiring a married woman in order to gain a procedure such as tubal ligation without her husband's consent. Our consent form has an area that the husband must sign. So are we practicing illegally?
Yes. Is short answer, yes, absolutely. You are from where? Nevis? Oh no, you have nothing in the law that says that. There is nothing. The women have been emancipated for a long time. I mean, the only countries that have sort of this outdated legislation about married women's property and whatnot are the overseas territories, because they still have them on the books.
That question was off the
Sorry? Was what? Off the record. Okay. We will treat that off the record. Off the record. But Antigua stopped it. But no, yes, it is. You don't need it. Yeah, no, if women object, you have to proceed. Because can a doctor refuse to treat you? They have the ethical standards. Technically, they can. Right, exactly. So technically they can. They'll say, well, I'm going to exercise my conscience and say that I won't be able to do it. But, no. So yes, any country that still is doing that, it still has that practice, of all of the countries in the OECS, there was no country that had any legislation regulating or requiring it. Contraception, termination of pregnancy. So termination of pregnancy stems from the right to life, and it says that it's underpinned by the UN monitoring mechanisms have all of them, the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, etc., have all argued about the consequences of unsafe abortions and the right to ensure that people have access to safe abortions. So I won't go into all of that, but essentially the situation that we have in the OECS. Ooh, somebody did thing on my slides. Thank you. What we have in the OECS is that abortion is not legal in any of the countries. It's not legal. Technically, it's not legal, but it is available in certain circumstances. So the default position is that abortion is not legal, but does the law allow for exceptions where it is illegal? And yes, it does. So in Antigua, the exception is for the life of the mother, or if the child will suffer grave physical or mental infirmity, which is one of the sort of the broader ones, because most of the others, that was Anguilla, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, Montserrat, really speaks to just the life of the mother. In BVI, it talks about the physical and mental health of the mother. There's a difference between the physical health and the physical and mental health, because either or applies in those circumstances. So you see that it opens the discretion of the medical professional in terms of making that decision. And it requires 2 doctors. I'm leaving the last one. In St. Lucia, you can get it for the life of the mother, for the health of the mother, of which 2 doctors must concur, and in cases of rape or incest, upon the production of a police report. And it must be conducted in a hospital. I mean, that alone creates restrictions, yes. You're right. Yeah, you're right. Yes. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I just realized that is true. Anguilla and BVI are the same. Or similar. Yeah, very similar. In St. Vincent, you notice that it is the issues also with the baby, so the health of the mother and serious physical impairment of the baby, and for family reasons. Much broader. The biggest lacuna, if you want to call it, who's that from St. Kitts? St. Kitts and Nevis? St. Kitts? I know, but I was looking for the minister. St. Kitts and Nevis has no exceptions, like Jamaica. There are no exceptions. It just says it's a criminal offense, termination of pregnancy is wrong, killing of an unborn, nothing. Okay, so there is a common law rules, cases that have been decided in the 1930s in the UK, which we apply in St. Lucia. It's a House of Lords decision that basically gives doctors, in the case where there is the question of saving one life and a choice has to be made, then the doctor cannot be held liable for making the choice in respect of the mother, because only the doctor will know what harm or what is the possibility of harm for the two. And they have to, according to Hippocratic Oath, ensure that the person who's most viable is the one that they save, So there is common law rules that allow for it. even if our legislation says it cannot be done, because at the end of the day, you will have very, very difficult situations where only medical professionals can manage. Yes, they know the doctors. Yeah, I'm not aware that there have been any prosecutions. I can't say for certain. I would think not, because marriage, we don't have to do that. It's just straight to the law. So the minimum age of marriage is typically 16, 15, or 14 across the board. And in some cases, there are variances for males as opposed to females. That question, whether there are any exceptions, that is, you can, if you're 16, you can, or 15 or 14, depending on which country, you need parental consent. You can also gain the consent of a court. If your parents decide not to consent, you can file a petition to the court and the judge can make a decision and consent. So that's a bit of an exception in that case. There's also an exception in respect of what is called marriage in articulo mortis. So if one of the parties is about to pass away, they're at death's door and they want to get married, and the person who is to consent is not present, the marriage officer will not be held liable if he performs the ceremony without the consent. Yeah. Pardon? If there is no, then there's also safeguards. So if there's no consent, a parent can file, can also ask the court for there not to be. So in some countries where we have community property, you can ask the court to make a finding that no community or property passes to the spouse, because for fear that the only reason for the marriage was to get their hands on, the thing. So the parents would retain control. So in that regard, the minor will still be treated as a minor, so they will not own the property until they have the age of majority, and the parents will control it. Of either of, yes, of either. When the person reaches 18, then they become an adult, and nobody can prevent an adult from taking something that's theirs. Well, that's right. If the parent have used it, the parent has used it, you can sue your parents. I don't think you'll have much of a case in that regard. She asked a question, what if the parents, but somebody asked, what if the parents uses the property so they completely dispose of and by the time you turn 18, there's no property? My answer was that there's not much that you can do at the end of the day, because it's technically not, except if it's something that was willed to you, it would be technically not yours, right? More than likely, property that the parents would have given you. You could have got it from another source, and then you would have a right of action against the parent, because in that case, it would have been holding it in trust for you. So it depends on what is the nature of the property and what your interest in that property is. If the parents it was not theirs and they held it in trust, you can sue them if they used it to your detriment, because they had an obligation to hold it for you until you were legally capable of acquiring it. Otherwise, if it's property, say they decided that they gave you a car, you're 17, and they gave you a car, you still can't own the car. All the registration documents will be in their name. It's their car. So that's a different issue. No. Private property is the nature of ownership. You can control certain things, but no. It's like sorry, I'm being a lawyer. I was going to say, example is in a will. You cannot say in a will that I'm going to give you this house located and you cannot sell it for 10 years. Once you get the house under the will, you become the owner of the house. So whatever that request that you made lapses according to law, because the law takes precedent, and you own the house and you do whatever you want with it. So that it's in the same thing. So no, the court cannot make some of those things. But the age of consent is, and the question is whether or not, when we spoke earlier about the age of consent is 6. Internationally, there is a big push to move the age of consent higher to avoid child marriages. 14 is pretty low for the BVI. And Turks and Caicos actually requires, it is 21 and under 21. Between 16 and 21, you need parental consent, right? Everybody else is at 18. But once you start to argue about moving the age of consent to marriage, then the question becomes, what about the age of consent to 6? Because that's the next move. And the flow is going to moving the age of consent up instead of moving it down. Or, it should be moved down to reflect the age at which persons get involved in their initiation of sexual activity. So, again, in unintended consequences, that was discussed earlier. We mentioned that. And that's why when you look at legislative reviews and amendments, you take those things into account. You never look at a law in isolation. It has consequences for a number of other things, other issues, which is a good thing why this process has us looking at so many different areas, because then you can see some of the implications and while you're cross-referencing. That's marriage, HIV, and discrimination. So we looked at whether for HIV and STIs, whether transmission, exposure, non-disclosure of HIV is criminalized. In most cases, no, but in an equal number of cases, yes. In St. Lucia, Transmission is the worst one, and that's criminalized, although I have to say, whoever drafted the law didn't understand the medical science of HIV, and Minister, it's not for you to go and change it. I'm going to treat this as a confidential statement I'm making to you. Everybody here witnesses. So the law is drafted to say if you are living with AIDS, if you're living with HIV and you transmit AIDS, that transmit AIDS, but you're transmitting AIDS, you're not transmitting HIV, which is, I mean, any lawyer will get you out of that. So it was badly drafted. In other countries, in Anguilla, for example, failure to disclose if the person is between 16 to 18. In other cases, it's not a criminal offense. Criminalization where transmission is deliberate in the BVI and exposure is an aggravating factor in the Trafficking Act. Not everything is captured there because it would have taken up too much space, but it actually is an aggravating offense. It aggravates most sexual offenses in almost across the board in most of the territories. So in the individual country reports, we'll have that detail. So if you are HIV positive and you either don't disclose it or you transmit HIV, then say the penalty for the offense was 10 years, it raises to something like 12 or 15 years because it is an aggravating factor. Protection from discrimination, we are doing very poorly, which I think we all know in terms of the laws to protect vulnerable populations. Most of our human rights provisions are found in the constitutions, which are closed. In law, we regard them as a closed list. So there's nothing that allows you to extend it. So for example, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is designed in such a way that at the end of the paragraph where it lists the grounds of non-discrimination, it says, and other status. So you can imply something in what is called the genus of the words that are mentioned. If it's something similar, you can import it. In our constitutions, it lists a certain number of things, usually sex, national origin, creed, about maybe 5 of them, and that's it. It's a closed provision. We do have, though, so you have in Anguilla, you will see that laws that prohibit specifically discrimination on the basis of HIV status, no. Sexual orientation, no. Discrimination on the basis of gender identity, no. For disability, no specific act, but it is found in various pieces of legislation. It's very telling that not one country has a specific law on the protection from discrimination of persons with disabilities or on other issues about access for persons with disabilities. There is one territory that has it. In my main presentation I'll have it, but I won't go and look for it now. It's in Montserrat, I believe, that has legislation, yes, that talks about access to, I think, public places for persons with disabilities. So as we're considered to be common law jurisdictions, and we have, with the exception of St. Lucia and Guyana, but principally we are still regarded as common law jurisdictions, which means that we have something called dual, we have a dualist approach in terms of law. There is a monist approach and a dualist approach. A monist approach means you have one system of law. Everything is your law, starting from the international law, your constitution, your domestic law, all that creates one system. A dualist system is where the international system is different and separate to your national system. For a convention that is ratified in a dualist state, it has to be passed as national legislation in your own parliament. Otherwise, it is of no effect. Well, it's of little effect. In other words, it's not enforceable. So somebody who, if the country is in breach of those provisions, then you will not be able to enforce that convention. if there is no domestic legislation bringing it into effect. And that's why you won't be able to. The second reason is that all of these conventions created committees where persons can report abuses, etc. And every single one of these optional protocols, we have all not signed on to these optional protocols. So that would have given the monitoring body for those treaties the right to come to hear complaints and to deal with these complaints, and none of us have signed on to any of these optional protocols, either under CRC, CRCS is the exception, but either under ICCPR, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights, CEDAW as well, none of them. And Trinidad withdrew, and then everybody, all three, withdrew, and then acceded again with reservations. So their reports would have these reservations, but none of the OECS territories even signed it in that regard. Yeah. So that's why these conventions have limited effect. The protocol? No. There are two. So they did one, but not that one for the committee. Everywhere where usually there is a treaty monitoring body for all of these major treaties. That's how you can monitor, you can determine whether or not the states are complying with their obligations. In the only one that we actually do is the ICCPR, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. That one we do, and so we have this what is called a periodic review process, and for CEDAW as well and CRC, those three. CEDAW's process is separate, but we do have on the ICCPR that review process. Everything else, I think after that experience, governments realized how onerous it is, and they decided that they wouldn't do it again. So that's the answer to your question. In terms of the distinction, there is a distinction for St. Lucia, BVI, and Montserrat in terms of their protection for persons living with HIV and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So in St. Lucia, we have protection under the Labor Code. I will very proudly say that when the Labor Code was being developed, I was the legal officer in the Ministry of Legal Affairs, and I led and designed the process to do the Labor Code. And I was also a member of the AIDS Action Foundation and worked very hard and insisted on including these provisions. And Professor Rosemary Antoine was the consultant, having been nominated by ILO. And she was also very sensitized to it. And we actually did not get some of the pushback we expected. The labor unions and the private sector agreed to include very, very, very wide non-discrimination clauses in the labor code. So, I mean, again, we keep saying that sometimes it's hard to do those things, but sometimes it isn't. You just have to do it at the right time. So these are the three countries that have some level of protection. Most other countries don't. Sexual abuse and violence. So, do countries have laws prohibiting domestic violence? We had yes for most. The minister said that in St. Kitts that their law was not enforced. I'm not sure. I think the law is enforced. we check things pretty thoroughly, but I will double check it. I was surprised to hear her say that, but as far as I know, the law is enforced. The 2014 one, because that's the latest one they have. It's when we did it, it was in draft and had not been passed. No. Anguilla in 2015. And you don't have a new one that you're considering? Anguilla has four major pieces of legislation that has to go through. There's a new Domestic Violence Act. Yeah, but it repealed you already repealed the 2015 Act. I can double check it. I know I did the research for Anguilla myself. But as again, that's why I say, so if I'm wrong, let me know. Yeah. No problem. So I will look at that again and change it. Most of the legislation has, and you will see all of the different categories of violence in terms of mental, sexual, emotional, verbal. In respect of Antigua and Barbuda, BVI, Dominica, even St. Lucia, most of the pieces of legislation are actually written so that it's gender neutral, so it encompasses everybody. That's right, because that was a bill that was submitted to everybody, and so most of us signed on to it. So it's all very, very similar, except that some has more protection than others. The newer pieces of anything after 2015 is actually quite extensive, particularly in relation to children. You have a lot more protections for children and reporting obligations across the board, a wide reporting obligation. So, yes? I will admit that is an error. I do apologize. That's not possible. It's impossible. No. I may have mistyped. Yes, St. Kitts and Nevis has a law on statutory rape. We all do. No. Femicide. Yeah. In Latin America, yes. There are tons of laws and all amendments to the criminal codes, but no, we don't have that. A murder, it will still be regarded as murder or homicide. But you don't have homicide, it will be a murder. Yeah? So, trafficking, the sexual abuse continues, grooming, child pornography, and trafficking. None of us have any laws preventing or prohibiting female genital mutilation. Trinidad does have specific laws on female genital mutilation. It's the only one that we found in the Caribbean, except for the Dutch territories, which are still being reviewed right now. Yeah. It's not done here, and I'm sure it can be got under assault because, yeah. But they want specific. Well, the idea was that they should have specific legislation prohibiting it, because it passed. That's why law has to be appropriate and reflective of your circumstances. Yes, Dr. Radix? Not that I'm aware. The question was, think about the scenario where you have certain countries, especially in Europe, who could very easily argue that it is not a practice, it is not that they do not have that cultural perspective. With the migration that happened over the last few years, it became an issue. And the question was whether or not there was law prohibiting it. There was no law. So you could not even prosecute. Yes, you may have been able to prosecute them under assault, but to specifically prosecute female genital mutilation, no. Right? And that's the question. So whether it's something that perhaps we should think of, I mean, it's not past reality that we can get people from anywhere in the world, but still, it does seem a little bit far-fetched that it will become an issue here. But Trinidad did pass the law. Find out what prompted it. Marital rape is not prohibited in 3 countries, in Grenada, Montserrat, and St. Kitts, Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In the countries where it is, it requires not just, in some cases it's considered sexual assault, in some cases it's considered rape, but it requires in most of them that you have to be separated, or there must be a decree nisi between you and your husband, etc. So in other words, if you're living with your husband and everything is fine and he rapes you, then you will not be able to bring a charge against him for that offense. Mm-hmm. 1991, R&R, Justice, it's my favorite case ever. I remember him, just love him. Keith of Kinkill, Lord Keith of Kinkill. He was the one who gave that decision. I love it. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I was going to say. Case law is it's a House of Laws decision, so it's not a Privy Council decision, so it's not in our court system, right? But it's very persuasive. So R&R actually decriminalized marital rape, or criminalized marital rape, in the UK. And yes, we have been able to rely on it. So before the legislation changed in some countries, some territories did rely on R&R. It's nothing. Okay, so we need to move a little faster because it's getting late. Yep. Comprehensive sexual education. This one is a ticklish one, and it's a question, and you know how complicated it is. But in terms of the law, we know that the Education Act, and in some cases the Constitution, guarantees the right to education. However, it doesn't guarantee the right to comprehensive sexuality education. The minister has authority to determine a curriculum in almost all of the acts of schools, etc. How do you guarantee the right to comprehensive sexuality education? What constitutes comprehensive sexuality education is not something that law, I think, can properly address. And it's not something that should be within the purview of law. It has to be something that is dealt with at the policy level, because it changes. It is not static. Comprehensive sexuality education is not static. It will change as things change in society, etc. And it is really, really too specific, but at the same time changeable for you to place it in law. It wasn't, yes, exactly, but not in terms of legislation. Right. That is actually also not prohibited by law. The only country that says that if you're pregnant and you're in school, you have to leave school is Jamaica. Yes, it's actually in the education rules. I checked the education rules because I knew it wasn't in the laws, so I checked the rules. Only Jamaica has it. You actually have to leave school, and then you can come back. Well, the rules is the statutory instrument. It's how the school gets its discipline and how the school is regulated. So, yeah. It's law. A statutory instrument is subsidiary legislation. So it is law in a sense. It's just subject to change much faster because usually a minister, by delegated authority under the main act, can pass it. Right? But it is law. So there's no law saying that you have to leave school. Again, a practice that has been exercised for so long. Jamaica and Guyana also have policies to promote the reintegration of students into schools, and that policies are being implemented. It's a collaboration between civil society and government in terms of doing it. On reintegration? Okay, that I did not know. Yes. Oh, that was not me. So we're on the last? Exactly. In fact, I don't know why parents have not sued the schools. If you are within the compulsory school age, you ought not to be denied entry to school. And so the law is there to actually protect students, but we don't, well, I know most parents don't use it. In fact, it really is a stigma issue. It's a question of stigma and not so much law, right? So I've been told to wrap up, which is very unfortunate. So coming so far at the end, but that's fine. And everybody needs to go. I don't know that you. Okay. So we good? Okay, fine. Thank you. Thanks. In terms of the population-specific issues, and I'm rushing through this very quickly, the whole presentation. Is same-sex criminalized? Well, we know the answer, except for the territories, the overseas territories. My constitution order in 2004, it was decriminalized in all of the overseas territories. Cross-dressing, we don't have it as far as I'm aware in our laws. It's something I actually have to go back and look at because we have some old criminal legislation that is called spent. In other words, it's not repealed, but you won't get it. You won't see it in the list of the laws for the country because it is so old. But it might still be in there. Sex work, yes. In Montserrat, it is sex work done by both male and female. It's the only country that actually specifies male sex work as opposed to just female sex work. They're very gender neutral. Maternal and child health services available to migrants. It's an issue I want to talk about. Because as it is now, yes, particularly children. We heard the minister, Dr. Martin, and his colleague talk about access by children, even if they're illegally in the country. That is supported by a numerous number of international conventions, which, yes, we have signed on to, and in fact, we actually adhere to. So I don't know that there's any country in the Caribbean that denies entry to any child at least the primary care. As far as we are aware, that doesn't happen. And that stems from research that was done by PANCAP to design a framework for migrant health. In respect of generally migrants, at this point in time, I did the research, some of the research, so it was done before and then I reviewed it again. At this point in time, with the exception of Barbados and the Dutch territories, and to a limited extent Antigua because of the medical benefit scheme, almost anyone coming into the country has access to primary health services without paying for it and without being asked your nationality or residence. You don't need to prove your residence. With the introduction of NIH, however, that is going to change slightly, and we have to question or ask whether or not it is something that is good, that is bad. Under the CSME, we are generally operating in one space. Most of the people you find especially in the OECS, who are accessing health services who are not from the country, are from other CARICOM countries. You don't find, and maybe Dominican Republic, but Haiti is a CARICOM country. So these are the two big ones. But we're talking mainly Caribbean nationals as well. So we really have to look at the question of NHI. Yes, I heard. Asking again to be terminated. We're really looking at the issue of NHI and its implications. Yes, I'll share it. Well, they will share it. And that's something that we really have to consider. But CARICOM is actually working on this issue. And so you'll be hearing more about it. Right. So we don't need to do that. I think we know what the gaps in the law are. These are not all of them. These are some of them. And there was more, but that is where I will stop, since I've had my second warning. On the third warning, you can be fired. So I'm done.
from 7. The bus, what time is it now? The bus, what we're going to say is that you're going to reach there by 6:30. So we have to leave the hotel at least by 7:10. We're going to be, the cocktail is at 7:30. Okay, so 7:20 we leave the hotel. No, from Mount Nevis. From Mount Nevis, okay? All right.